Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is Charly Edsitty, an anchor and reporter with ABC News in Houston. Charly, who is Navajo, grew up in Arizona and began her television career in Phoenix. She has covered wildfires, tropical storms, hurricanes, and overlooked Indigenous communities in northern Arizona. She is the host of the recently released season of ABC News' Reclaimed podcast series called The Lifeblood of the Navajo Nation, where she follows the history of the oppression and exclusion that has kept the Navajo from their water. Charly, thanks so much for being with us on the show this week.
Hi, Dennis. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
We're going to get into Reclaimed right away, but while we have you and the U.S. election's barely in the rear view, I guess, what's the mood down there post-election?
Well, we are a week out from the election. It was exactly a week ago today. And I would say that, depending on who you voted for, you're either incredibly happy or you are probably disappointed. But that's the beauty of the American democracy, the election system. But yeah, it's definitely, I think, just a lot of action and movement in the last couple of days for sure.
Certainly in the days leading up, at least up here, we were hearing, it's going to be days, weeks before we know what happens here, what the results are. Do you think the results were that shocking?
I mean, I think that, a lot of people did not expect the margin with the Electoral College to be as wide as it turned out to be. Obviously, the battleground states across the United States were of high focus. And, Donald Trump managed to get all of the swing states that were in question. And so I think several people were very surprised about that for sure.
Some of those swing states were states that were expected that, Indigenous peoples might have a pretty big voice in those seats. And despite what we see on social media, we hear that, a lot of Indigenous people do back Trump, or at least the Republican Party. Is that something that you've seen or heard in your reporting?
Oh, absolutely. More and more Indigenous people are getting more consideration by candidates who are vying for whatever political office. And it's great to see that. It's great to see our elected officials finally taking note of Indigenous voters, because collectively as a whole, we do have the power and the numbers to be able to swing certain states, whether from Democrat or Republican. I think the more that Indigenous voices and voters are being focused in on, I feel like, it's definitely incorrect to assume that Indigenous people will vote a certain way with a certain party every single election cycle. I think that collectively as a whole, there are so many different opinions about how Indigenous people want to see the United States move forward, very diverse opinions. And I really can't say that Native people vote Democrat or Republican. I think it just really depends on who you're talking to and what area of the country they live in.
For sure. Just lastly here on the election, Charly, we've been here before. Any thoughts on what tribes might expect over the next 4 years?
Well, the hope always is that whoever is the president of the United States will give consideration to issues that affect Indigenous tribes across the United States. Obviously, the issue at hand here with the podcast series Reclaimed is water rights. And so ultimately, it's going to come down to the Congress, how the Congress will vote on matters like that, and whether or not they're actually going to pass any sort of legislation that affects Indian country, and whether or not it makes it to the president's desk. I mean, it still remains to be seen. But obviously, every election cycle and every president, Indigenous people are really hoping that our issues are taken seriously and are at the forefront.
Well, Charly, let's move to your recent endeavor that you're touching on there. In addition to your hosting and reporting, you're fronting the season of the ABC podcast Reclaimed. Before we get into your season, maybe could you give us a little background on the Reclaimed series itself?
Sure, yes. So this is actually the fourth season of the franchise Reclaimed. And the other seasons touch on different issues and topics, like the life and story of Mamie Till Mobley, who was the mother of Emmett Till, the young man who was brutally murdered back in the 1950s. And so it really takes a really up close look at some of the stories in American history that don't really get a lot of attention, or perhaps are told, but maybe from the perspective other than the community that it actually affects. And so for this fourth season of Reclaimed, it's called The Lifeblood of Navajo Nation. And it really focuses on the fight, the decades-long fight for water rights and access to clean water for the Navajo Nation.
I guess we'll talk a bunch more about it, but how did you first or become involved in the podcast?
So I actually was approached by a producer with ABC Audio to be a part of the project. They really wanted to find an Indigenous journalist who could help tell this story. And what I really appreciate about this series is that it's told from the perspective of Indigenous people, the people who are actually affected by what's happening. I think, in some cases, and, too much, a lot of Indigenous issues and stories and history are told from a different perspective other than Native people. So I really appreciate that ABC Audio wanted to collaborate with me. We actually work, our parent company is Disney. So we're all in the same family. I just work for the ABC affiliate in Houston. But yeah, it was definitely exciting to get the opportunity to work with a very talented group of producers.
So again, we've kind of touched on it, but I guess, Charly, can you tell us more about the lifeblood of Navajo Nation?
Yes. So it is a 4-episode series, again, that focuses on the history of how thousands of people right now in 2024 across the Navajo Nation don't have access to clean running water. And I think for a lot of Americans and even Canadians, it can be shocking to hear that in this day and age, there are still Indigenous people who don't have basic necessities that many people across North America take for granted. And I don't think a lot of people really knew that this was happening until the COVID-19 pandemic that particularly hard, that hit the Navajo Nation particularly hard. And so I think that was really eye-opening for so many Americans seeing that happen. I know a lot of the networks down here were in the communities covering this issue. Many of us were being told to wash our hands and do what we could to stay as healthy as possible, but that really wasn't the reality for hundreds, if not thousands of people across the Navajo Nation who just don't have running water coming out of their faucets.
Definitely something that many here in Canada can relate to. Before getting more into the podcast, I guess, Charly, as somebody with a background in TV, what was it like moving into podcasts?
That's a great question. It definitely felt like flexing a different muscle in journalism. My background, my entire career has been in broadcast television, so I'm very used to having a visual medium to be able to help convey stories. So it definitely was a transition, adjusting to just audio, but I really feel like there are so many opportunities to tell really powerful and impactful stories just by listening to voices and just hearing sounds and really letting the words and your imagination really connect with what's being shared.
Charly, much more to talk about here with the podcast and your own career. We just have to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Charly Edsitty, an anchor and reporter with ABC News in Houston, and we're talking about her podcast that is out and available now wherever you get your podcasts, called Lifeblood of Navajo Nation. Charly, can you give us the real background here on why the Navajo Nation, the largest group of Indigenous peoples in the United States, has limited access to clean water?
Yeah, Dennis, this actually goes all the way back to the 1920s. And the podcast really is a bit of a history lesson for anybody who really doesn't know all of the history of how we got to this point in 2024. So it really goes back to 1922 when a document called the Colorado River Compact was signed. So at that time, we did have certain states that were already established, Nevada, California, Arizona was, I think, just a few years old at that point. And so, obviously this is the desert Southwest. And so the point of the document was to really divide up the Colorado River and section it off and assign certain parts of the river and the water to all of the developing states at that time. And, water, obviously a very scarce resource in the desert. So it was really, really crucial to do this so that large cities here in the United States like Las Vegas, Los Angeles, Phoenix, could really be established and continue to thrive. And so that document, really included a lot of the different states nearby the Colorado River, but it did not include any of the indigenous tribes or communities that were already using that water long before there was a United States. And so it really helps the listener walk through all of the history and understanding how we got to this point in 2024. And it also focuses a lot on the different settlements that have been attempted with neighboring states who have access to the river, and the Navajo Nation's attempts to work with those states to try to get them to essentially share some of their water with us so we can have access to it. And so it's really eye-opening and just, very fascinating and at times very heartbreaking and discouraging just to see what's happened here over the course of several decades, really all of this starting back in 1922.
Like you say, Charlie, a lot of people wouldn't know about this. Well, why do you think that this is something that isn't known by the greater public?
Well, I think that it's one of those things where if it doesn't affect you personally, it's really not at the top of mind. But I think that it's really important for American citizens, as well as even Canadians, to understand that the establishment of the United States was beneficial for certain groups of people. And really, it's important to understand that, the system and the structure as it stands now really was not set up to be a level playing field for everybody who was living here in the United States. And unfortunately, indigenous tribes have really been left out of important conversations that were started many, many years ago to have access to things like water. And unfortunately, it's having a massive impact on our communities right now in 2024. And the fight is still continuing to try to get access to water and other infrastructure.
Certainly, access to clean drinking water, something that many First Nations up here can relate to. Still dozens on boil water advisories. Was this something that's affected or continues to affect members of your own family?
And that was a great question. That was definitely something that I was curious to discover because on my mother's side of the family, I always grew up having running water inside of my grandparents' home. But I actually learned through the course of reporting on this very issue, my own family history of how my grandparents managed to get running water inside of their home back in the 1970s. But when you think about the 1970s and the greater United States, so many people at that point had already had plumbing and running water inside their homes for decades at that point. But that was something that my own grandparents were not able to get until they were probably, maybe well into their 40s or 50s. And so I think that really puts it into perspective that, my family had to wait for several years before they were able to get something that other Americans at that point had been enjoying for, probably the entirety of their lives.
Right. How does sovereignty for the Navajo Nation play into this all?
And that's a great question. And it's an important thing to understand that the Navajo Nation is a sovereign nation and that we really, we have our own government system and we forge a path for ourselves and make decisions for ourselves, as opposed to looking to the federal government to be able to do that. And it's really a collaborative partnership with the federal government that, we try to work with them to make decisions about our future. And, I think that having access to clean running water for the entire nation is a part of sovereignty, and it's important for our future. How much longer are we going to have to sit and fight and fight and fight just to have clean access to clean running water inside of homes, thousands of homes across the United States, or across the Navajo Nation, whereas other people across the United States have never had to fight this battle. So I definitely think that sovereignty plays a lot into this as well, and that's an issue that we delve deep into in the series as well.
Charly, can you tell us where things stand now with the fight for clean water?
Absolutely. So earlier this year, they actually we focus in on the settlement that's happening right now with the state of Arizona. And so earlier this year, the Navajo Nation Tribal Council did vote to approve a settlement that would include $5 billion in order to build infrastructure across the reservation, so that way people would have access to that clean running water. And so the first hurdle was getting it passed by the tribe. And so now this is moving on into legislation in Congress, and it has been introduced to Congress, but there hasn't been a vote yet. I think it's gone to committee one time. So it's a slow moving process once it gets to that point, and really time can only tell what's going to happen with this. But the $5 billion price tag in order to build this infrastructure and really get things moving forward, that could be a sticking point for some of our representatives who would look at that dollar amount and say that's way too much money. And, the United States, the federal government doesn't have that much money to give. So again, it's just a bit of a waiting game right now to see what happens.
Well, some of those representatives should look at some of the lawsuits up here and might think otherwise of the $5 billion. Charly, the Reclaimed franchise has been well received, award-winning podcast. What are you hoping that listeners take away?
My hope is that people are educated about what's happening in tribal communities, particularly the Navajo Nation, and that this really piques their interest to learn more about Indigenous communities and some of the issues that are affecting all communities across the United States. Unfortunately, the Navajo Nation, this has been something that's been going on for decades. It's been a decades-long fight, but unfortunately, it's not unique to Navajo Nation. So many other Indigenous communities across the United States have their own issues and their own fights, and I really hope that people walk away with a better sense of what's happening in Native communities in 2024, and that they will educate themselves and, maybe look to their elected officials and ask those important questions about what are we doing to help out our Indigenous communities across the U.S.
For sure. And as I mentioned, Lifeblood of Navajo Nation, ABC's Reclaimed podcast series, available now, started running this past week. Charly, time for one more quick break, but much more to talk about here on Face to Face. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Charly Edsitty, a Navajo news anchor and journalist with ABC News in Houston, Texas. Charly, when did you know that you wanted to be a journalist?
I knew that I wanted to be a journalist when I was in college. I was in the middle of, I think, my sophomore year, and I started out as a pre-dental major, thinking that I wanted to have my own dental office and do all of that. But I quickly realized that science and math was really not my strong point. So I decided to switch majors, and I was curious about journalism, had always enjoyed writing, and the rest is history. I loved it. I enjoyed the rest of my college years as a journalism major, worked for the campus newspaper, and I knew I had found my passion.
I think I always hear, journalists say, I just didn't get math, didn't get science, and I was watching one of your videos where it talked about, oh, I think I'd be a lawyer otherwise. Like, I think every journalist pretty much wanted to be a lawyer, just didn't want to go to school for that long or pay for that. Did you face challenges as an Indigenous reporter?
Yeah, I think that it's few and far between that you see Indigenous reporters, especially in larger newsrooms. I've worked in Phoenix, and Houston is my second market that I've been in. And in both cases, I am either the only Indigenous person employed at the station, or I'm one of very few people. And it can be intimidating at times when you're pushing and you're fighting for certain stories that impact Indigenous communities, and you're the only voice in the room pushing for those stories. But over the years, I've learned to just be really, really confident in my ideas and my story pitches, and also really try to be an advocate for the Indigenous communities who are watching the coverage and want to see their issues and their community reflected accurately in mainstream news. So it can be lonely at times, it can be tough at times, especially if people don't see the value in covering Indigenous communities. But it's a fight that I'm willing to continue to do. And anytime I get to tell a story about Indigenous communities, it's always one of my favorites.
We're somewhat partnered up here with ICT, formerly Indian Country Today, and a lot of great journalists over there. And we're lucky to have some on the show here. But how would you describe, I guess, the current state for Indigenous reporters in the United States? And how could we get more Indigenous peoples involved in journalism?
Over the years, I've been involved with the Indigenous Journalists Association since I was in college. And I have to say, it's been amazing to see the growth in numbers of membership and the students and everybody who is now getting involved in an industry that when I was in college, it was very, very sparse. And it's just great to see that there's a lot of renewed interest in being a journalist and the importance that comes with the job. I mean, it's, a respectable position to have, and there's a lot of expectations on your shoulders. But I think it's just really wonderful to see that there are so many people who are out there covering our communities all across North America. And I just really think that the industry as a whole has really grown. And I would say even newsrooms have become more inclusive and aware, especially in the time that I've been in broadcast news. I feel like more people in position of management are understanding that they have to have diversity in their newsrooms. And a big part of that is finding and giving opportunities to Indigenous journalists who otherwise might not be able to have a platform to be able to share good journalism.
Charly, you've covered some pretty big stories, whether they be weather-related or otherwise. What are some of the things that stick out for you over your time so far in journalism?
I have had the pleasure of covering, thousands of stories at this point. And as you mentioned, a lot of severe weather here in Houston. The Indigenous community here in Houston is not as large as, in places like Phoenix, where I used to live and work. But, I definitely am a true breaking news reporter. I'm on the morning shift, so I am usually up at 2 o'clock, getting my day started, and usually covering whatever's happening across Houston. It's a very active news market and a lot of breaking news, and but it keeps me on my toes, and I really enjoy it.
Charly, often ask this of our guests, and I'll ask you if you have any advice to those looking to get into journalism.
Yes. I always tell people that it's always important to enjoy the journey. Journalism as a career has been an incredible blessing for me. It challenges me every single day. And whenever I get discouraged, I always just have to remind myself that it's so important to keep in mind that you're advocating for a community, you're advocating for, people who otherwise may not be able to advocate for themselves. And so I just recommend giving it a try and finding what area of journalism that you enjoy, whether that's newspapers, whether it's magazines or on television or perhaps a podcast, And yeah, I mean, we need more diverse voices covering issues that are important to communities all across North America. So yeah, give it a chance. It's a great career.
Awesome stuff, Charly. Thanks so much for being with us this week on the show. Really appreciate you taking some time. I know you got a lot going on.
No, I appreciate it so much. Yeah, you guys, I would say stay warm up in Winnipeg. It's still feeling like summer down here in Houston, but I know it's starting to get pretty cold up there.
Yeah, well, it's been not too bad so far, but the worst is set to come. So yeah, we'll have to come down there and have a visit. Thanks again, Charly. Wish you all the best with the podcast and everything else.
Thank you, Dennis. I appreciate it.
And that is all the time we have for the show this week. You can always catch up on any episodes you may have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca, or by visiting our APTN News page on YouTube. Of course, this show and past episodes are also available as podcasts. You can find those wherever you download your podcasts. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for tuning in to Face to Face this week. We'll see you back here in 7 days.